September 11, 2001 attacks marked one of the darkest days in modern history. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives when terrorists hijacked
Yeah, getting
airplanes and
better.
crashed them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. But beyond the tragedy that unfolded in the United States, the events of 9/11 had a ripple effect that reached across the world, particularly in the Middle East. These attacks not only reshaped global politics, but also deepened racial and religious tensions, leading to years of conflict and misunderstanding. To understand the chain of events that followed, it's important to look at Osama bin Laden's motivations. Bin Laden was the leader of Al Qaeda, a militant Islamic organization. His resentment towards the United States stemmed largely from America's military presence in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War. As a Saudi himself, he viewed this as a violation of the sacred land where Islam's two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina, are located. He also deeply opposed what he saw as Western influence corrupting Islamic societies and supporting governments he believed were unjust. For bin Laden, the 9/11 attacks were intended as a statement, an attempt to strike at what he called the symbols of American power. The World Trade Center represented economic strength, and the Pentagon represented military might. However, while he sought to push the US out of the Middle East, his actions achieved the opposite. Instead of weakening American influence, they promoted the United States to become even more deeply involved in the region through military intervention. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, fear and grief consumed the United States and much of the world. Governments tightened security, airports changed forever, and new counterterrorism laws were passed almost overnight. But with this fear also came widespread anger and blame. Many innocent Muslims and people of the Middle East descent living in Western countries became targets of discrimination. Even though they had nothing to do with the attacks, Islamophobia rose sharply, and media portrayals often reinforced negative stereotypes about Arabs and Muslims. In response to 9/11, President George W. Bush declared what became known as the War on Terror. This phase symbolized a massive global campaign aimed at defeating terrorism wherever it existed. The United States, supported by its allies, launched an invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. The main goal was to remove the Taliban from power for sheltering Al Qaeda members, including bin Laden. Initially, many people supported this action, believing it would bring justice and make the world safer. However, as the years went by, the conflict became one of the longest wars in American history. The US military struggled to eliminate terrorist groups completely as new ones continued to form. The war caused enormous civilian suffering, villages destroyed, families displaced, and thousands of lives lost. Even though the Taliban government fell quickly, instability and corruption filled the void. What was meant to be a short term campaign turned into a 20-year conflict that ended with the Taliban regaining control in 2021. For many observers, this raised questions about whether the war on terror truly achieved its goals or simply prolonged the cycle of violence. Just 2 years later, in 2003, the United States turned its attention to Iraq. Led by Saddam Hussein, American leaders claimed that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a threat to global security. They also suggested, incorrectly, that Hussein's government has links to Al Qaeda and the 9/11 attacks. Despite a lack of solid evidence, the United States and its allies invaded Iraq in March 2003. Within weeks, Saddam Hussein's regime collapsed, and he was later captured and executed. However, the war did not bring peace or democracy that was promised. Instead, it left behind a shattered nation. Iraq's infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and roads were destroyed. Millions of Iraqis lost their homes. The sudden removal of Hussein's government created a power vacuum that allowed extremist groups to grow. One of these groups eventually evolved into ISIS, whose brutal actions spread instability across the Middle East and beyond. The Iraq War is now widely viewed as one of the most controversial decisions in U.S. history, one that caused deep mistrust towards the West in the Arab world. What we have to understand here is the human cost of these wars cannot be overstated. In Afghanistan, Iraq, and surrounding regions, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, and millions were forced to flee their homes. Refugees sought safety in neighboring countries or in Europe, often facing dangerous journeys and discrimination upon arrival. Entire generations of children grew up only knowing conflict, losing access to education and healthcare. The psychological toll has been equally devastating. Many survivors live with trauma from bombings, loss, and displacement. Soldiers, too, returned home with post traumatic stress and moral injury from what they witnessed or participated in. While governments spoke about defending freedom and security, the people most affected were ordinary families who had no part in the violence. For them, 9/11 marked the beginning of a long era of pain that still echoes today. Outside the war zones, the effects of 9/11 were also deeply felt in the form of social division and racism. In Western countries, Muslims and Arabs faced increased suspicion, hate crimes, and constant stereotyping. Many were unfairly profiled at airports, questioned by authorities, or bullied at school. The media often fueled these fears by repeatedly linking Islam to terrorism. This created a dangerous misunderstanding that the actions of a small group of extremists somehow represented an entire religion. In truth, Islam, followed by over a billion peaceful people, condemns violence and promotes compassion, justice, and mercy. Many Muslim Americans even worked as doctors, firefighters, and volunteers during the attacks and the wars that followed. Yet their loyalty was still questioned. These unfair judgments left lasting scars and continue to affect the Muslim communities to this day. Looking back, the story of 9/11 and its aftermath teaches us powerful lessons about the cost of hatred and revenge. It shows how one tragic day led to decades of suffering across the continent, from New York to Baghdad. While terrorism must be condemned, the global response revealed that violence cannot solve violence. Instead of reducing extremism, wars and discrimination often create new anger and resentment, feeding the very problems they aim to fix. This history reminds us to think critically about how fear can influence decisions and policies. When nations act out of anger rather than understanding, innocent people pay the price. True progression comes when we choose empathy over division, diplomacy over destruction, and dialogue over distrust. The world cannot afford another cycle of hatred born from misunderstanding. As we reflect on the legacy of 9/11, we must remember both the victims of the attacks and the countless innocent people who have suffered since then. The tragedy reshaped the world, but it also gave us a chance to learn from our mistakes. Hatred, whether it comes from extremists or from those who respond to them, only create more suffering. The lesson we should take away is not one of revenge, but one of caution and compassion. If history has shown us anything, it's that peace can only be built on understanding, not domination. We must work to see each other as people, not enemies, to question what we are told, to learn from different perspectives, and to stand against injustice in all its form. By remembering what the past was with honesty and empathy, we can hope for a better future where tragedies like 9/11 never happen again, and where no community has to pay the price for another's action.